Alyssa Grant's day at the park with her son was meant to be simple fun until everything went wrong. Faced with skepticism, racial bias, and escalating tension, what started as a request for basic access quickly turned into a public battle for justice. With her husband Ethan by her side, Alyssa's courage was pushed to the limit as they stood up against a system that refused to listen. What happened when they fought back? And how did their story inspire a movement for change? Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to follow this powerful story of resilience, and let us know in the comments, what would you do in Alyssa's situation? The sun hovered high over a bright, cloudless sky as Alyssa Grant wheeled herself up the paved path of Greenview Amusement Park. The laughter of children, the hum of roller coasters in the distance, and the smell of popcorn on the breeze created a backdrop that promised nothing but joy and fun. To the casual observer, it seemed like any other family outing, a mother and son on a day of adventure. But Alyssa's situation was far from ordinary. Alyssa, a 35-year-old African-American woman, sat in her wheelchair with a composed but determined expression. Her stomach protruded slightly, showing the signs of a pregnancy nearing its final stages. Complications in the pregnancy had forced her to use the wheelchair for months now, and while she had learned to manage, it hadn't been easy. Beside her walked her 7-year-old son, Marcus, practically bouncing with excitement. His bright eyes scanned the towering rides, the vibrant signs, and the endless sea of people moving around the park. "Mom, can we go to the big Ferris wheel first? It's taller than our house," he exclaimed, his voice full of awe. Alyssa smiled down at him, her heart swelling with love. "Of course, sweetheart, but first we need to get a pass for the rides, remember," she replied. Marcus nodded, darting a few steps ahead, only to circle back to her side, unable to contain his excitement. Today was supposed to be about family, about giving Marcus a day of joy after weeks of being cooped up inside. Alyssa had spent many days confined to their home, exhausted from the pregnancy and the stress that came with it. Her husband, Ethan, couldn't join them just yet. He was wrapping up some work, but he had promised to meet them at the park later. As Alyssa made her way through the park's winding paths, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Here, amidst the laughter and joy, she hoped to forget the discomfort of her pregnancy for a while. She would watch Marcus smile and laugh, and they would make new memories together. But something in the air felt off. As they approached the section of the park designated for people with disabilities, a nervous tension settled in Alyssa's chest, like a distant storm cloud creeping toward a sunny sky. The accessible entrance to the rides was quieter than the rest of the park, with only a few people milling about. The shade from nearby trees offered some relief from the sun. Alyssa was grateful for the peace, even if only for a moment. She reached for the folder in her bag that contained her medical papers, ready to present them to anyone who asked. She had been through this process before, showing documentation to prove that her pregnancy complications required her to use a wheelchair. Normally, it was a smooth procedure. As Alyssa and Marcus neared the gate, she noticed a security guard standing in front. He was an older man, broad-shouldered with graying hair and a stern expression. His name tag read Daniels. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that made her uneasy. She approached him, her voice calm and polite. "Hello, I'm here with my son. I'd like to get access to the rides for people with disabilities." Daniels didn't move. He stood there, staring down at her with a look that felt colder than the shade they stood under. His lips pressed into a thin line as he sized her up. Finally, after what felt like too long, he spoke. "You sure you're in the right place?" His tone was curt, dismissive. Alyssa blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his question. "Yes, I'm in the right place. I have my medical documents if you need to see them," she said, holding up the folder. Daniels glanced down at the folder in her hand, but made no move to take it. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, his gaze drifting from her to Marcus. "We've had a lot of people trying to take advantage of the system lately," he muttered. "You'd be surprised what some folks will do for special treatment." The comment stung. Alyssa's smile faltered, but she forced herself to remain composed. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered skepticism from people who assumed she was looking for special privileges. But the sharpness of his tone, the way he looked at her, sent a wave of unease through her. "I'm not here for special treatment," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm here because I need this access due to my pregnancy complications. I can show you the documents." Daniels huffed and shook his head. "You don't look like you need it that bad," he said, his voice dripping with doubt. "People these days, they'll say anything." Alyssa's pulse quickened. She knew what was happening. This wasn't about her documents or her condition. It was about the way she looked, the color of her skin, the assumptions people made when they saw her, a black woman in a wheelchair asking for assistance. She tightened her grip on Marcus' hand, trying to keep her frustration in check. "Please," she said, her voice firm, "I have every right to be here. My son and I are just trying to enjoy the park." But Daniels crossed his arms again, shaking his head as if he had already made up his mind. "I don't think this is going to work," he said. "You'll have to wait while I get someone to check this out." Alyssa's stomach churned as she watched Daniels step aside to radio for assistance. Marcus, sensing the tension, stayed close to her side, his wide eyes filled with confusion. "Mom, is everything okay?" he asked, his small voice barely above a whisper. Alyssa gave him a reassuring smile, though inside she felt anything but calm. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to touch his arm. "We're just sorting something out." But as she looked around, she could feel the stares of other park-goers on them. The quiet murmurs from people passing by made her feel exposed, vulnerable. It was as if they were all silently judging her, wondering if she really needed the wheelchair, wondering if she was just another person trying to cheat the system. Alyssa's mind raced, trying to think of how to defuse the situation. She didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to draw any more attention to herself or Marcus. All she wanted was for her son to have a good day, to experience the joy of the amusement park like any other child. But the longer she waited, the more it became clear that Daniels wasn't interested in helping her. He had already decided she was guilty of something, even if there was no reason to believe it. The moments dragged on, and the tension in the air thickened. Finally, Alyssa saw two police officers walking toward her, their expressions stern, their eyes scanning the scene as if they were preparing for trouble. One of them, a younger man with sharp features, stepped forward. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, looking down at Alyssa in her wheelchair. Alyssa held up her folder again, her voice calm but laced with frustration. "There's no problem. I have medical documentation that shows I need to use a wheelchair due to pregnancy complications. I'm just trying to use the accessible entrance so my son and I can enjoy the park." The officer, whose name tag read Morgan, barely glanced at the folder before shaking his head. "Look, we've had a lot of people faking stuff like this," he said. "Just because you've got a doctor's note doesn't mean you can cut the line." Alyssa's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. They were treating her like she was lying, like she didn't belong. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm not trying to cut the line. I'm following the park's rules, just like everyone else. Please, just let us through." But Officer Morgan crossed his arms, his face hardening. "I don't think so. We need to verify that this is legitimate." Alyssa's frustration reached a breaking point. She had shown them everything, her documents, her proof, and yet they refused to listen. Marcus tugged on her sleeve, his voice small and fearful. "Mom, why are they being mean to us?" She stroked his arm gently, her voice trembling. "I don't know, baby. I don't know." Just as Alyssa was about to plead her case again, her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. She quickly answered, relief flooding her voice as she spoke. "Ethan, you need to get here. They're not letting us through." "Hold tight. I'm on my way," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with concern. Within minutes, Alyssa saw Ethan making his way toward them. He was tall with a calm, authoritative presence. His expression tightened when he saw his wife and son surrounded by officers. "What's going on here?" Ethan asked, his voice measured but firm. Officer Morgan turned to face Ethan, his expression unreadable. "We're just making sure everything checks out here," he said. "Your wife's saying she needs special access, but we've had people trying to pull stunts before." Ethan's jaw clenched. "She's not pulling a stunt. My wife has medical complications. I can vouch for her condition, and she has the paperwork to prove it. Morgan gave Ethan a cold look. It doesn't work like that. We have protocols. We need to verify. Ethan stepped closer, his frustration evident. Look, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm telling you that my wife has done nothing wrong. You need to let us through. But before Ethan could say more, another voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? It was Captain Thompson, a higher-ranking officer who had been called to the scene. He looked between Ethan, Alyssa, and the officers, his expression stern, but slightly less hostile. Ethan nodded. Yes, there is. My wife is being denied access because these officers refuse to acknowledge her condition. She's pregnant, in a wheelchair, and has medical documentation to prove it. Captain Thompson glanced at Alyssa's documents, but his expression didn't soften. We've had a lot of false claims lately, he said. We're just doing our job. Alyssa felt a wave of despair wash over her. Even with Ethan here, even with all the evidence, they still wouldn't believe her. The tension was palpable, the air thick with frustration and disbelief. As more people gathered, the murmur of the crowd grew louder. Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest, her breath quickening. This was supposed to be a day of joy for Marcus, but now it was turning into a nightmare. And the worst part was, it wasn't over yet. The moment Captain Thompson's words left his mouth, the crowd surrounding Alyssa, Ethan, and the officers grew louder. The murmurs of onlookers swirled in the air, a mix of confusion, disbelief, and sympathy. Several people pulled out their phones, recording the scene from a distance. Alyssa could feel the weight of their stares, the judging eyes of strangers who saw only the surface of what was happening. Alyssa clenched the handles of her wheelchair. "What more do you need to see?" she asked, her voice breaking with frustration. "I've shown you everything I have. I'm not trying to cheat the system. I just want to take my son on the rides." Marcus stood by her side, his small hand still gripping her sleeve. His once excited face had grown pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't understand why his mother was being treated this way, and Alyssa's heart broke knowing she couldn't fully protect him from it. Captain Thompson shifted uncomfortably but stood his ground. "We've got procedures," he said, almost defensively. "We have to make sure people aren't taking advantage." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice measured. "Taking advantage of what, of needing a wheelchair? You're not making sense, Captain. My wife has done nothing wrong. She's following your park's rules. You're treating her like a criminal because you've already made up your mind." Daniels, the original security guard, stepped forward. "Look, we don't need a lecture. If you want special treatment, you've got to prove you need it. That's all there is to it." Alyssa's jaw tightened. She had been polite, calm, and reasonable, but their hostility toward her was becoming unbearable. She could feel the old anger rising, the one she had been taught to suppress her entire life, the anger that came from being seen as less than because of the color of her skin. Ethan sensed her growing frustration and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Alyssa, it's going to be okay," he murmured, though even he wasn't sure what would happen next. The confrontation continued to draw more attention. Families stopped to watch, whispering amongst themselves. Some passers-by looked sympathetic, while others appeared indifferent, their faces marked with impatience as though the scene was nothing more than an inconvenience on their day out. A woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice loud enough to carry. "Leave her alone. She hasn't done anything wrong." Several others began nodding in agreement, but the officers remained unmoved. Captain Thompson glanced at the growing crowd, his face tightening with frustration. His authority was being challenged in front of the public, and he didn't like it. Alyssa could feel her pulse quickening, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This was no longer just about her needing access to the rides. This was about proving that she deserved the same respect and treatment as anyone else. But no matter what she said or did, they refused to see her as anything more than a problem. "We're going to have to call this in," Officer Morgan said abruptly, reaching for his radio. "Well, have more officers here to straighten this out." Alyssa's eyes widened in disbelief. More officers! Wasn't this already enough? Her heart pounded in her chest, fear rising as she imagined the situation spiraling even further out of control. Ethan's face darkened with frustration. "More officers," Ethan repeated, his voice strained. For what you're escalating this over nothing. Sir, Thompson said, his voice dropping to a colder tone, you need to back off. You're interfering with our process, and we're doing what needs to be done. Alyssa's stomach tightened with anxiety. This was going too far. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take, especially with Marcus watching everything unfold. Her son, who had been so excited just moments earlier, was now clutching her hand in silence, his eyes brimming with confusion and fear. Mom, why are they being mean to you? Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. Alyssa's heart ached. She bent down as much as she could and pulled him close. It's going to be okay, sweetie. We'll figure this out. But as she said the words, she wasn't sure if she believed them herself. Ethan had always been a man of reason, a man who believed in following procedures and keeping calm in difficult situations. But today, standing in front of his wife and child as they were disrespected, something inside him snapped. Captain, Ethan said, his voice firm but controlled, I know you're trying to do your job, but you're crossing a line here. My wife has done everything she's supposed to do. She's given you her documents, she's explained her situation, and yet you keep pushing. You're not enforcing the rules, you're using them as an excuse to harass her. Captain Thompson's eyes narrowed. Watch your tone, sir. This is an official process, and we're just making sure everything checks out. If you continue to interfere, Ethan's voice rose. You're the ones interfering. You're stopping my family from enjoying a simple day at the park. You're treating my wife like a criminal because you've decided she doesn't deserve respect. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, growing louder as people began voicing their support. Phones were now held high, capturing every second of the escalating confrontation. Captain Thompson's expression darkened, and he glanced at Officer Morgan, who seemed uneasy under the watchful eyes of so many people. We need to move this along, Morgan muttered to Thompson. The crowd's getting restless. Thompson nodded curtly and turned back to Alyssa. Mom, we're going to need to ask you to leave the park until we can verify your documents. Alyssa's breath hitched. Leave, I've shown you everything I have, am not leaving until you explain why you're treating me like this. Ethan stepped forward, his jaw clenched in frustration. We're not leaving. You're not kicking us out because you refuse to do your job properly. Thompson's patience had run out. Sir, you're about to get yourself into trouble, he said, his voice low and threatening. Step back. Alyssa could feel the situation slipping out of control. Her hands trembled as she held on to Marcus, trying to shield him from the growing tension. She felt trapped in her wheelchair, trapped by the officers' narrow minds, trapped by a system that seemed designed to disbelieve her. Ethan was furious. His normally composed demeanor was unraveling as he watched his wife and son be treated with contempt. He was done being polite, done trying to reason with people who had already made up their minds. This is harassment, Ethan said, his voice rising. You know it. I know it. Everyone here knows it. Captain Thompson's face reddened, and he stepped closer, his tone icy. Sir, if you don't back down, we're going to have to remove you. Ethan's eyes blazed with anger. Remove me for what? Standing up for my family. You're out of line, Captain. Before Thompson could respond, a voice called out from the crowd. This is wrong, a woman shouted. She stepped forward, holding her phone up high. I've been recording this whole thing, and am not the only one. You're harassing this family for no reason. Other voices joined in, echoing the sentiment. Let them through, someone yelled. She's got her papers. Thompson hesitated for the first time, his gaze flicking nervously toward the crowd. The pressure was mounting, and even he could sense that things were spiraling out of control. But before he could speak, Officer Morgan intervened. Sir, he said to Thompson quietly, we might want to rethink this. There's too much attention on us now. Thompson shot him a sharp look, but the crowd was growing restless. More phones were pointed at them, and the murmur of discontent was becoming harder to ignore. Thompson knew he was losing control of the situation, and it made him angry. We're calling for backup, Thompson snapped. This is getting out of hand. Alyssa's heart raced. Backup. What did that mean? Were they really going to escalate this further? She couldn't believe what was happening. All she wanted was a normal day with her family, but now it felt like everything was falling apart. As Thompson and the officers tried to regain control of the situation, the crowd only grew more vocal. Several people began shouting at the officers, demanding they let Alyssa and her family go. Others approached Ethan, offering words of support. "This is discrimination, plain and simple," a man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've got everything on video," another woman added, waving her phone. "They can't get away with this." Ethan was grateful for the support, but his focus remained on Alyssa and Marcus. Marcus had grown silent, his small hand still gripping his mother's sleeve. His innocent excitement had been replaced by confusion and fear. And Alyssa's heart ached, knowing that he was witnessing this moment of injustice firsthand. "I don't want to leave," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. "I just want to go on the rides." Alyssa bent down, pressing her forehead to his. "I know, baby. I know." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to stay strong, for Marcus and for Ethan. They had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to let these officers intimidate her into leaving. The officers, sensing the growing unease in the crowd, huddled together for a moment, speaking in hushed tones. When they broke apart, Captain Thompson's expression was hard. "All right," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "We'll let you stay, but we're going to follow up on this." Alyssa exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over her. For now, the immediate threat had passed, but the damage was already done. She could feel it in the way Marcus clung to her, in the way the crowd had rallied around them, and in the way Ethan's fists were still clenched at his sides. As the officers finally stepped back, allowing Alyssa, Ethan, and Marcus to move forward, the crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. A few people clapped, while others continued recording, determined to share the story of what had just unfolded. Alyssa wheeled herself forward, her hands trembling on the armrests. She could barely process what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Ethan walked beside her, his face tight with anger. "We'll talk about this later," he muttered under his breath. "This is far from finished." Alyssa nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest. She had hoped for a peaceful day with her family, but now it felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. She glanced down at Marcus, who was still holding her hand tightly. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. They went on a few rides, but the joy had been sucked out of the experience. Marcus smiled faintly, but the sparkle in his eyes had dulled. Alyssa could barely keep her mind on anything but the confrontation, replaying the officer's words over and over in her head. By the time they left the park, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the ground. Alyssa wheeled herself toward the parking lot, Ethan walking silently beside her. As they reached the car, Ethan opened the door for Marcus before turning to face Alyssa. "We need to talk about what happened," he said, his voice low and serious. "This isn't over, Alyssa. We can't let them get away with this." Alyssa nodded. "I know," she replied softly. "But what can we do?" Ethan's eyes darkened. "We're going to fight this. We're not letting them treat you like that and get away with it." Alyssa sighed, her mind still reeling from the events of the day. "I'm tired, Ethan. I don't know if I have the strength for a fight right now." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression fierce. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "Well, get help. Well, make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Alyssa looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and love, even in the midst of her exhaustion. She knew he was right. What had happened today wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger. And if they didn't stand up and fight, who would? As they drove home in silence, the weight of what lay ahead settled over them. The fight was only beginning. Alyssa sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the half-empty cup of tea in front of her. It had been 2 days since the confrontation at Greenview Amusement Park, but the events still played on a loop in her mind. The looks of suspicion from the officers, the judgment from the crowd, and the fear in Marcus' eyes. Ethan stood by the counter, pacing restlessly. His frustration had been simmering ever since they left the park, and now it was boiling over. "We can't just let this go," he said, for what felt like the 100th time. "We have to do something." Alyssa nodded, though her energy was low. She hadn't slept well the past few nights, her thoughts spinning too fast to settle. Her body ached, and the stress of the situation had only made her pregnancy more difficult to manage. "I know," she said quietly. "But what do we do? I don't have the strength to go to war with the police department, Ethan." Ethan stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression resolute. "We don't have to do it alone. There are people who will help us, people who care about what happened. Well, get a lawyer. Someone who knows how to deal with these kinds of cases." Alyssa sighed, rubbing her temples. "A lawyer. You really think we need to go that far?" Ethan walked over and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "Alyssa, they disrespected you. They treated you like a criminal in front of our son. If we don't fight back, they'll keep doing it to other people." Alyssa looked into his eyes, seeing the determination there. She knew he was right. What had happened at the park wasn't just a personal insult, was part of a larger problem, one that affected people like her every day. And if they didn't take a stand, who would? "I'm scared, Ethan," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm scared of what this will turn into." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "I know. But we can't back down. We've been through too much to let this go." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Alyssa and Ethan exchanged a glance before Ethan got up to answer it. Standing at the door was Tanya Lopez, Alyssa's best friend. Her face was set with a mix of concern and determination. "I came as soon as I could," Tanya said, as she stepped inside, pulling Alyssa into a tight hug. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" Alyssa smiled weakly. "I'm holding up. But it was awful, Tanya. They treated me like I was nothing, like I didn't belong there." Tanya's eyes flashed with anger. "That's not going to fly. We're not going to let them get away with this." Ethan closed the door behind her and crossed his arms. "That's what I've been saying. We need to take action." Tanya nodded. "You're right, and I know just the person who can help. There's a civil rights lawyer in town, Samuel Green. He has handled cases like this before, and he's not afraid to go up against the system. I'll call him for you." Alyssa's heart skipped a beat. This was starting to feel real, like the beginning of something much bigger than she had anticipated. The idea of fighting a legal battle against the police department terrified her. But the thought of letting them get away with what they had done was even worse. "Do you think he'll take our case?" Alyssa asked. Tanya gave her a confident smile. "He'll take it. And once he does, we're going to make sure everyone knows what happened." The next morning, Alyssa and Ethan sat in the modest office of Samuel Green, a well-known civil rights lawyer in their town. Green was in his mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. His reputation for fighting for marginalized communities preceded him, and he had won several high-profile cases against local authorities over the years. As they waited for him to join them, Alyssa's stomach fluttered with anxiety. The reality of their decision to fight back was sinking in, and she wasn't sure what to expect. She squeezed Ethan's hand for comfort, grateful that he was by her side. When Green entered the room, he greeted them warmly, but there was a seriousness to his expression that told Alyssa he already understood the gravity of the situation. "Thank you for coming in," Green said, as he took a seat behind his desk. "Tanya gave me a rundown of what happened, but I'd like to hear it from you." Alyssa took a deep breath and began recounting the events at the amusement park. She told him about the security guard's suspicion, the officer's refusal to listen, and the growing crowd that had witnessed her humiliation. As she spoke, the memories stirred up fresh feelings of anger and sadness, but Green listened attentively, his expression growing more focused with every detail. When she finished, Green sat back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk. "It sounds like you were subjected to racial profiling and discrimination," he said. "They had no legitimate reason to question your documentation or deny you access. This is a clear violation of your civil rights." Ethan leaned forward, his frustration evident. "We want to hold them accountable. They can't treat people like this and just walk away." Green nodded. "You're right, and we can pursue this on several fronts. We'll file a complaint with the police department and the park itself. We'll also look into a possible civil lawsuit for emotional distress and discrimination." Alyssa's heart raced at the thought of going up against the police department, but Green's calm confidence reassured her. "Do you think we have a chance?" she asked. Green smiled slightly. "I wouldn't take the case if I didn't think we had a chance." But I'll be honest with you, these things can get ugly. The police department will likely deny any wrongdoing, and they'll try to paint you as the problem. It won't be easy, but if we stay focused, we can make a difference." Ethan nodded, his expression determined. "We're ready." Alyssa glanced at Ethan, then back at Green. She wasn't sure if she was truly ready for what was to come, but she knew she didn't have a choice. She couldn't let fear stop her from standing up for herself and for others who might face the same injustice. As soon as the lawsuit was filed, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Videos of the confrontation at the park, taken by bystanders, had already gone viral on social media. Now, local news stations began picking up the story, and Alyssa found herself at the center of a public conversation about racial profiling and discrimination. Tanya, always the organizer, helped Alyssa prepare for the attention. She encouraged her to speak out, not just about what had happened to her, but about the larger issue of how Black and disabled individuals were often treated with suspicion and hostility. "This is bigger than just you, Alyssa," Tanya said during one of their many late-night phone calls. "Your story is a chance to shed light on what so many people go through every day." Alyssa knew she was right, but the attention was overwhelming. She received hundreds of messages on social media, some of them supportive, but others hateful and filled with vitriol. "How dare you play the victim," one message read. "You're just trying to cause trouble. People like you always do." Alyssa's chest tightened as she read the cruel words. She had expected some backlash, but seeing the ugliness in writing made it real in a way she hadn't anticipated. Ethan noticed her distress and pulled her close. "Don't let them get to you," he said softly. "We're doing the right thing." But the weight of the public scrutiny was heavy, and it followed Alyssa wherever she went. Reporters showed up at their home, seeking interviews. Neighbors, who had once been friendly, now avoided eye contact. Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching her, judging her. Marcus, too, was affected. He had been quiet since the incident, but one night, as Alyssa was tucking him into bed, he asked, "Mom, why are people being mean to us?" Alyssa's heart broke at his question. She sat beside him on the bed, stroking his hair gently. "Sometimes people don't understand, sweetheart. And when they don't understand, they say hurtful things." "Is it because we're different?" Marcus asked, his small voice filled with innocence. Alyssa nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "Yes, sometimes it is. But being different doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. We're strong, and we're going to be okay." Marcus seemed to consider her words for a moment before nodding. "Okay, Mom." As he drifted off to sleep, Alyssa sat beside him, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had to be strong for Marcus, for Ethan, and for herself. But the fight was only just beginning. In the weeks following the lawsuit's filing, support for Alyssa and Ethan grew. Tanya organized a rally in front of City Hall, drawing hundreds of people who wanted to stand in solidarity with Alyssa and demand accountability from the police department. Alyssa stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out over the sea of faces. Signs reading "Justice for Alyssa" and "End Racial Profiling" were held high, and the energy in the crowd was palpable. Tanya stood beside her, a megaphone in hand, and introduced Alyssa to the crowd. "We're here today because Alyssa's story isn't just her own, it's the story of countless people who have been mistreated and disrespected because of who they are. But today, we say no more." She took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Alyssa Grant," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm a mother, a wife, and a woman who just wanted to take her son to the park. But because of the color of my skin and the wheelchair I was sitting in, I was treated like I didn't belong." The crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. "I'm here today, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been judged, mistreated, or disrespected because of who they are. We all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter our skin color, our abilities, or where we come from." Tears welled in Alyssa's eyes as she spoke, but she pressed on. "This fight isn't easy, and it's not over. But we're not backing down. We're going to keep fighting until justice is served, not just for me, but for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in unison to chant, "Justice for Alyssa." As Alyssa stepped back from the microphone, Tanya hugged her tightly. "You were amazing," she whispered. Alyssa smiled through her tears, feeling a surge of hope. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she wasn't alone. The fight ahead was daunting, but she knew now that she had the strength and the support to see it through. Despite the momentum from the rally, Alyssa and Ethan soon faced their first major setback. The police department issued a public statement, denying any wrongdoing and claiming that the officers had followed protocol. They framed the incident as a misunderstanding, deflecting blame and accusing Alyssa of overreacting. The statement infuriated Ethan. "They're twisting everything," he said, pacing the living room as Alyssa sat at the table, reading the statement over and over. "They're trying to make it look like you're the one at fault." Alyssa's hands shook as she put down the statement. "They're trying to discredit me," she said, her voice thick with frustration. "They're saying I was being difficult, that I refused to cooperate." Ethan slammed his hand against the wall. "This is what they do. They lie to protect themselves." Alyssa's head ached from the stress of it all. "What do we do now? How do we fight back against this?" "We keep pushing," Ethan said. "We don't let them get away with it." But as the days passed, Alyssa felt the weight of the fight growing heavier. The public was divided. Some supported her, while others believed the police version of events. The hateful messages on social media intensified, and the pressure became suffocating. One evening, as Alyssa lay in bed, her body aching and her mind racing, she turned to Ethan. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "You're strong, Alyssa. Stronger than you know. And we're going to get through this." Alyssa nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. She wanted to believe Ethan's words, but the road ahead seemed impossibly long. And as much as she tried to stay hopeful, the fight for justice was taking its toll. The day had arrived. After weeks of preparation, sleepless nights, and emotional exhaustion, Alyssa and Ethan stood outside the courthouse, ready to face the police department in court. Alyssa had spent the morning going over her testimony with Samuel Green, her lawyer, trying to steady her nerves. She knew this was their best shot at justice, but the weight of the moment felt almost too much to bear. "You're going to be fine," Samuel had reassured her. "Just tell the truth. The evidence is on your side." But as Alyssa stood in the courthouse lobby, the enormity of the trial hit her. This wasn't just about the confrontation at the park anymore. This was about fighting a system that seemed stacked against her. A system that would rather protect its own than admit to any wrongdoing. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her family, for her community, for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of who they were. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, pulling her out of her thoughts. "We're in this together," he said, his voice low and steady. "No matter what happens in there, we've already shown them we're not backing down." Alyssa smiled faintly, grateful for his support. Despite the fear that gripped her, she knew she wasn't alone. As they entered the courtroom, Alyssa felt the eyes of the public and the media on her. The courtroom was packed: journalists, community members, and even a few familiar faces from the rally Tanya had organized. The tension was thick, and Alyssa knew that whatever happened today would have lasting consequences. At the front of the room sat the police department's legal team, a group of polished lawyers who were no doubt prepared to discredit Alyssa's story. But she pushed the thought aside. She had Samuel, and she had the truth on her side. That had to count for something. As the judge entered and the trial officially began, Alyssa took a deep breath and prepared herself for what was to come. The trial began with the opening statements from both sides. Samuel stood first, his voice clear and confident as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, today we are here because my client, Alyssa Grant, was subjected to racial profiling and discrimination by officers who refused to recognize her rights. What should have been a peaceful day at the park with her son turned into a nightmare. Nightmare that has caused her emotional distress and public humiliation. The evidence will show that Alyssa did everything she was supposed to do, yet she was treated as if she were trying to deceive the system, simply because of who she is." Alyssa listened intently, her heart racing as Samuel outlined their case. He spoke of the videos taken by bystanders, the documentation Alyssa had provided at the park, and the officer's refusal to listen. He painted a clear picture of the injustice she had faced, and for the first time in weeks, Alyssa felt a glimmer of hope. But the police department's lawyer, a woman named Lisa Harding, was quick to respond. Her opening statement was calm and measured, but Alyssa could sense the subtle undertones of doubt and skepticism in her words. The defense will show that the officers involved acted in accordance with department policy, Lisa began. This was not a case of discrimination, but a misunderstanding. My client, the police department, takes claims of discrimination seriously, but in this case, the facts will show that Mrs. Grant was treated fairly and that the officers followed protocol in a situation where clarity was needed. Alyssa's stomach churned as she listened. Lisa Harding was skilled, there was no denying that. She was already laying the groundwork to paint Alyssa as the one who had overreacted, who had been difficult, who had refused to comply. When the opening statements were over, the judge called for the first witness, and Alyssa's anxiety spiked. She knew that the next few hours would be crucial. The first witness called to the stand was Officer Daniels, the security guard who had first stopped Alyssa at the amusement park. As he recounted his version of events, Alyssa sat tensely, her fists clenched in her lap. Daniels described how he had approached Alyssa, explaining that he needed to verify her need for special access. "It wasn't personal," Daniels said, his voice flat. "We've had issues with people trying to take advantage of the system before. I was just following protocol." Samuel stood to cross-examine, his face calm but serious. "Mr. Daniels, you've said that you were simply following protocol. But isn't it true that my client provided you with documentation of her medical condition almost immediately?" Daniels shifted slightly in his seat. "Yes, and isn't it true that you dismissed that documentation without fully reviewing it?" Samuel pressed. Daniels hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I looked at it, but it didn't seem sufficient." "Sufficient in what way?" Samuel asked, his voice rising slightly. "Was the documentation unclear, or was it simply that you didn't believe her?" Daniels faltered, and Samuel seized the opportunity. "Mr. Daniels, do you often question the validity of medical documents provided by disabled individuals, or was there something specific about Mrs. Grant that led you to doubt her?" The question hung in the air, and Alyssa's heart raced as she waited for Daniels to respond. He glanced toward the defense table, clearly unsure of how to proceed. We've had incidents in the past," Daniels finally muttered, "but you had no specific reason to doubt Mrs. Grant's documentation, correct?" Samuel asked. Daniels reluctantly nodded. "No specific reason." Samuel let the moment linger before returning to his seat. Alyssa exhaled slowly, grateful for his sharp questioning. It was clear that Daniels had no real justification for the way he had treated her. Next, Officer Morgan was called to the stand. His testimony followed a similar pattern. He claimed that he was simply trying to maintain order and that Alyssa had been uncooperative. But when Samuel questioned him, it became apparent that Morgan had barely glanced at the medical documentation Alyssa had provided. Samuel's voice was calm but insistent as he questioned Morgan. "Officer Morgan, you've stated that you were concerned about maintaining order. But would you agree that escalating the situation by calling for backup was unnecessary in this case?" Morgan shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know what to expect. Things can get out of hand quickly." "But there was no sign of a threat, was there?" Samuel pressed. "No aggression, no disruption, just a woman in a wheelchair trying to access the park with her son." Morgan hesitated before answering. "No, there was no threat." Samuel nodded, his expression hardening. "Thank you, Officer Morgan."
"That's all?"
As Morgan stepped down from the stand, Alyssa felt a wave of relief. Samuel was methodical, chipping away at the officers' defenses, exposing the cracks in their stories. But she knew that the hardest part was yet to come, her own testimony. When the judge called Alyssa to the stand, her heart pounded in her chest. She had known this moment was coming, but the weight of it hit her all at once. She glanced at Ethan, who gave her a small, encouraging nod, then stood and made her way to the witness stand. Samuel approached her with a reassuring smile. "Alyssa, can you describe for the court what happened that day at the amusement park?" Alyssa took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I went to the park with my son Marcus. I'm in the final stages of my pregnancy, and because of complications, I've had to use a wheelchair. I knew I would need special access to the rides, so I brought my medical documentation with me. When we got to the entrance, I showed the security guard, Mr. Daniels, my documents, but he refused to let us through. Samuel nodded. How did that make you feel? Alyssa's throat tightened as she remembered the humiliation she had felt. It made me feel like I didn't belong, like I wasn't being seen as a person who needed help, but as someone who was trying to take advantage of the system. And what happened when the officers arrived? Samuel asked gently. Alyssa swallowed hard. They treated me like a criminal. They questioned me over and over, even though I had already shown them my medical papers. They refused to listen, and they made me feel small, like I was less than. As she spoke, Alyssa could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing down on her. The memories of that day were still raw, still painful. She could see Marcus' frightened face, hear the judgment in the officers' voices. She had never felt so powerless in her life. Samuel stepped back slightly. Alyssa, is it fair to say that this experience caused you significant emotional distress? Alyssa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Thank you, Alyssa, Samuel said softly. No further questions. As Alyssa prepared to step down, Lisa Harding rose from the defense table. Her eyes were sharp as she approached, and Alyssa braced herself for the cross-examination. Mrs. Grant, Lisa began, her voice cool, you've stated that the officers made you feel like a criminal. But isn't it true that you refused to cooperate with their requests for additional verification? Alyssa stiffened. I didn't refuse to cooperate. I showed them my medical papers, but they ignored them. But the officers were following protocol. Correct, Lisa pressed. They were simply doing their job. Alyssa's anger flared. Their job wasn't to treat me like I was lying. I did everything I was supposed to do, and they still didn't believe me. Lisa's smile was thin, almost condescending. So, you felt disrespected. But would you agree that the officers had a responsibility to ensure that the system wasn't being abused? Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what Lisa was doing, trying to twist the narrative, trying to make it seem like the officers had been reasonable. They had a responsibility to treat me like a human being, Alyssa said, her voice shaking. But they didn't. Lisa Harding's smile faltered slightly and she stepped back. No further questions. As Alyssa stepped down from the stand, her legs felt weak. She had spoken her truth, but she wasn't sure if it would be enough. The trial stretched on for several more days, with both sides presenting their arguments. Samuel continued to build a strong case, highlighting the officers' failure to follow proper procedures and the emotional toll the incident had taken on Alyssa and her family. But Lisa Harding and the defense fought back just as hard, trying to paint the officers as professionals simply doing their jobs. By the time the closing statements were made, Alyssa felt emotionally drained. She sat beside Ethan, holding his hand tightly as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The room was silent as the judge spoke. After reviewing the evidence and the testimonies provided, it is clear that the officers involved acted inappropriately in their handling of Mrs. Grant's situation. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. They had won. But the judge's next words tempered her relief. However, while the court recognizes the distress caused, the damages awarded will be limited, as the defense has shown that there was no intent to cause harm. Alyssa exhaled slowly, her emotions a mixture of relief and disappointment. They had won, but it wasn't the complete victory she had hoped for. As the courtroom emptied, Samuel approached Alyssa and Ethan. We did it, he said with a small smile. It's not everything we wanted, but it's a step in the right direction. Alyssa nodded, her heart still heavy. She had hoped for more accountability, more justice. But as she looked around at the people who had supported her, she realized that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Ethan squeezed her hand. We're going to keep pushing. This isn't the end. Alyssa smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of determination. No, it's not, she agreed. We've come this far, and we're not stopping now. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of mixed emotions for Alyssa and Ethan. They had won the case, but the limited damages awarded felt like a hollow victory. The media portrayed it as a triumph, but for Alyssa, there was a lingering sense of unfinished business. The police department issued a short statement acknowledging the court's decision, but refused to accept any direct blame. There was no public apology, no disciplinary actions against the officers involved, just silence, as if the whole ordeal was something they wanted to forget. Ethan tried to stay positive, constantly reminding Alyssa of the progress they had made. "We forced them to acknowledge their mistake," he said, one evening, as they sat together in the living room. "That's something." Alyssa nodded, but her heart was heavy. "It doesn't feel like enough," she admitted. "We went through all of that, and they still get to walk away like it didn't matter." Alyssa knew he was right. The outpouring of support from the community had been overwhelming. Messages of encouragement flooded her social media, and people she had never met reached out to thank her for standing up against injustice. Tanya, who had been a constant source of support throughout the ordeal, visited them often. "We've opened the door for change," she said during one of her visits. "The fight isn't over, but you've made people listen." Still, the weight of what they had been through lingered. Alyssa felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She hadn't fully processed the toll the trial had taken on her, and the public scrutiny that followed didn't help. There were still hateful comments online, people who insisted that she had overreacted, that she was trying to make something out of nothing. But Alyssa refused to let the negativity silence her. She had come too far to back down now. A few weeks after the trial, Samuel Green contacted Alyssa and Ethan with some surprising news. A civil rights organization had taken notice of their case and wanted to partner with them in pushing for broader reform. They were calling for changes in police training, particularly around how officers handle interactions with people of color and those with disabilities. "We're going to push for systemic changes," Samuel explained during their meeting. The lawsuit was just the first step. Now we need to focus on changing the policies that allow things like this to happen in the first place. Alyssa felt a flicker of hope. This was exactly what she had wanted, the chance to prevent others from going through what she had experienced. Tanya was equally enthusiastic. "Well, organize another rally," she said, her eyes alight with determination. "This time, we're not just demanding justice for you. We're demanding changes that will protect everyone." The rally, held in front of the courthouse, drew even larger crowds than the first one. Alyssa stood at the center of it all, feeling the energy of the people around her, people who believed in what she was fighting for, people who wanted to see real change. This time, Alyssa felt stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and mistreated. As she took the stage to speak, the crowd quieted. Alyssa's voice rang out clear and steady. "I stood here months ago to tell you my story. Today, I'm here to tell you that the fight for justice isn't over. It's not just about what happened to me. It's about what happens every day to people who look like me, people who live with disabilities, people who are treated like they don't belong." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in support. "We deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who we are or where we come from," Alyssa continued. "And we won't stop until the system changes, until officers are held accountable, until our communities feel safe, and until everyone is seen for who they are, not just the assumptions made about them." As the rally continued, Alyssa felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. In the months that followed, Alyssa and Ethan's lives slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy. The teenagers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable under Jake's stern gaze. But Alyssa's fight for justice didn't end, it simply shifted. She and Ethan became advocates, speaking at events, partnering with civil rights organizations, and working with local lawmakers to push for reforms in police training. Their case became a touchstone for broader conversations about race, disability, and the treatment of marginalized communities. For Alyssa, the most important change was within herself. She had gone from feeling powerless to finding her voice, and now she was using that voice to help others. Her strength, which had been tested in ways she never imagined, had only grown stronger. One evening, as Alyssa and Ethan sat on the porch watching Marcus play in the yard, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. "I didn't think we'd get here," Alyssa said quietly, leaning her head against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "We've come a long way." Alyssa watched Marcus laugh and run, her heart swelling with love for him. "Do you think he'll remember what happened?" she asked softly. Ethan thought for a moment. "Maybe. But if he does, he'll remember how strong you were, how you stood up for yourself and for him." Alyssa smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I just want him to know that we did the right thing." "He knows," Ethan said gently. "We all know." Months turned into a year, and while the initial urgency of the trial had passed, the changes that Alyssa and Ethan had fought for were starting to take root. The police department, under pressure from the public and local leaders, began implementing new training protocols. Alyssa and Ethan continued to speak out, using their platform to raise awareness and push for further reforms. They met with other families who had experienced similar injustices, offering support and guidance. One day, as Alyssa was preparing for another speaking event, she received an unexpected call from the police department's new chief, who had been brought in after the fallout from the trial. "I wanted to reach out to you personally," the chief said, his tone respectful. "I know the department has a long way to go, but I want you to know that we're committed to making things better. What happened to you should never have happened, and we're working to ensure it doesn't happen again." Alyssa was taken aback by the call. It wasn't a formal apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement she had received from the department since the trial. "Thank you," Alyssa replied, her voice steady. "I appreciate that. But I'll be watching closely to make sure those changes happen." The chief chuckled lightly. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As Alyssa hung up the phone, she felt a sense of closure that had been missing for so long. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like real progress was being made. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Alyssa, Ethan, and Marcus returned to Greenview Amusement Park. It had been over a year since the confrontation, and though Alyssa had been reluctant to return, Ethan had convinced her that it was time to reclaim the space that had once brought them so much pain. As they walked through the gates, Alyssa felt a mix of emotions. Memories of that day flooded her mind, but alongside them came a sense of strength. She had faced her fear, fought for justice, and emerged stronger on the other side. "Mom, can we go on the Ferris wheel?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with excitement. Alyssa smiled down at him, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course we can," she said. "Let's go." As they approached the ride, Alyssa noticed the park had made some changes. The accessibility lines were more clearly marked, and staff members greeted them with warmth and respect. It was a small but significant Victoria sign that slowly but surely things were changing. As the Ferris wheel lifted them into the sky, Alyssa looked out over the park, the sun casting a warm glow over the landscape. She glanced at Ethan, who smiled back at her, and then at Marcus, whose laughter filled the air. In that moment, Alyssa felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought for herself, for her family, and for justice. And while the fight was far from over, she knew they were heading in the right direction. They had faced the odds and emerged stronger, and now, together, they looked to the future with hope. The story of Alyssa and Ethan's fight for justice became a symbol of hope and resilience. It wasn't just about one incident, it was about standing up against a system that too often overlooked the people it was meant to protect. Their story inspired others to come forward, to share their own experiences, and to demand better from the institutions that were supposed to serve them. Alyssa's journey wasn't easy, but in the end, she had found her strength, not just for herself, but for her family and her community. And while the fight for justice continued, Alyssa knew that together they could make a difference. Thank you for watching this powerful story. If Alyssa's journey for justice and resilience inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that spark hope and bring light to issues that matter. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next upload, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters in the ongoing fight for change. Stay tuned for more stories that uplift, inspire, and push for a better tomorrow. He paused, locking eyes with the jury. We have a chance today to show that Silver Creek is a place where everyone is valued, where justice prevails. Let's not waste that chance. The jury's decision, when it came, was a victory for Ethan's client and for the town as a whole. The verdict sent a clear message: Silver Creek was ready to move forward, to embrace the values of equality and justice that Ethan and Nia had fought so hard for. The victory in the courtroom marked the beginning of a new chapter for Silver Creek. Slowly but surely, the town was becoming a place where people felt safe to speak out, to stand up for what they believed in. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still pockets of resistance, but the progress was undeniable. Ethan and Nia, though still facing challenges, felt a sense of peace they hadn't known in a long time. They had fought for their love, for justice, and for the future of Silver Creek, and now they were seeing the fruits of their labor. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan turned to Nia, a soft smile on his lips. "You know," he said, his voice filled with affection, "when I first met you, I had no idea how much my life would change." Nia chuckled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You had no idea how much you'd change mine." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We've come so far. Sometimes I still can't believe everything we've been through." Nia nodded, her heart full. "It hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." As they sat together, the quiet of the evening surrounding them, Nia thought about the journey they had been on, the battles they had fought, the love they had shared, and the future they had helped create. Silver Creek was changing, and so were they. A few weeks later, the community held a town-wide celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event, organized by Nia and Martha Sullivan, was a way to bring everyone together, to celebrate the town's journey toward inclusion and justice. The celebration was held in the town square, where people from all walks of life gathered, young and old, black and white, conservative and progressive. It was a symbol of how far Silver Creek had come, and a reminder that the town's future was something everyone could help shape. As the sun set over the square, Ethan and Nia stood together on the main stage, looking out at the crowd. The atmosphere was warm and joyful, filled with laughter and music. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and perseverance. Martha Sullivan took the microphone, her voice carrying across the square. "Tonight, we're celebrating more than just the progress we've made. We're celebrating the people who made that progress possible, people like Ethan and Nia, who showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't done this for recognition, but hearing the town come together in support of the changes they had fought for filled her with a sense of pride and fulfillment. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nia danced together under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The future, once uncertain, now felt bright with possibility. And though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, just as they always had. As the years passed, Silver Creek continued to evolve, becoming a beacon of hope for other towns grappling with the same struggles. Ethan and Nia's love story became part of the town's legacy, a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to back down in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't just about love. It was about standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In the end, Silver Creek had become a place where people from all walks of life could live, love, and grow. And though the road had been long and hard, it had been worth every step. Ethan and Nia, together, had built a legacy of love and hope, one that would endure for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content. Thanks for your support, and remember, love and justice always prevail. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a beautiful day, full of possibility. And as Derek looked out, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future, not just for himself and his family, but for the world they were all helping to shape. Mia and Marcus ran into the room, their laughter filling the air as they played a game of tag around the furniture. Jessica followed close behind, her smile bright and warm. Derek turned away from the window and watched his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. They were his reason for everything, for standing tall in the face of adversity, for sharing his story, for doing his part to make the world a better place. And as he looked at their faces, full of love and laughter, Derek knew that the future was bright. It wouldn't always be easy, but it was full of potential, full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to create a world where empathy and understanding prevailed. In the end, that was all he could ask for. As the day wound down, Derek sat back at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last few months. From the confrontation at the electronics store to the inspiring conversations with young people, he had witnessed firsthand how one small action could create lasting change. Every step forward mattered. He logged into his blog and drafted another post, this time focusing on the idea of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. He knew there was more work to do, always more people to reach, more stories to tell. But he felt confident that he was on the right path. As Derek prepared to hit publish, he paused, thinking of everyone who had been following his journey. If you've been inspired by this story and want to be part of a community that stands up for empathy, justice, and change, don't forget to subscribe to the blog. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories about making a difference one step at a time. Together, we can build a future that's brighter for everyone. Satisfied, Derek hit the publish button and leaned back in his chair. The work wasn't done, but with every new subscriber, every person who read and connected with his message, he knew they were getting closer to the world they all deserved. And that was worth everything. Jason looked out at the horizon, the sun setting over the rooftops of the homes they had helped create. This is what it's all about, isn't it? Mia smiled, leaning into him. Yes, it is. They stood there, hand in hand, knowing that they had left a legacy of hope and change. Their fight for housing justice wasn't over, but they had come so far, and the future was brighter than ever. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about inspiring journeys, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on the latest stories of change, justice, and hope. Subscribe today and join us as we continue to explore stories that make a difference. The company had to choose a side. Either it stood for the values of fairness and inclusion, or it would continue to enable discriminatory practices. We're prepared to take this to court, Olivia said, her tone firm. But we'd prefer to resolve this internally, with full accountability and corrective action. Jenna Riley's actions have been damaging to both the company and its passengers. It's time for her to take responsibility. Jenna's lawyer, Robert, leaned forward, his voice firm but clearly on the defensive. Ms. Brooks, Miss Carter, I think we can all agree that this situation has been difficult for everyone involved. But let's not lose sight of the fact that Jenna was acting within her role as a flight attendant, trying to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. Ava cut him off again, her patience wearing thin. No, Mr. Marston, this isn't about safety or comfort. This is about respect, about human dignity, and the fact that you're still trying to frame it otherwise tells me you don't understand the gravity of what's happening here. She turned her gaze back to Jenna, her voice softening but still carrying the weight of her conviction. Jenna's face was tense, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. Ava could see the internal battle playing out in her eyes, the fear of losing everything she had worked for, the stubbornness of not wanting to admit fault, and perhaps, just beneath the surface, the faint flicker of remorse. Jenna's lawyer leaned in to whisper something to her, but Ava could see that the real struggle was happening within Jenna herself. After what felt like an eternity, Jenna finally spoke, her voice low and unsteady. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Jenna said, her eyes downcast. "I was just trying to do my job." Ava didn't respond immediately, allowing Jenna to continue. "I've worked for this airline for years, and I always thought I was doing the right thing," Jenna said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I see now that I wasn't thinking about how my actions affected people. I was wrong." Ava remained silent, waiting. "Really bad." Jenna looked up, meeting Ava's eyes for the first time. "I'm sorry, Ava. I really am. I didn't see it before, but I do now, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Ava nodded, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Jenna's apology was far from perfect, and there was still a long road ahead. But it was a start. A necessary step toward accountability and healing. "We'll discuss the terms of a resolution," Olivia said, her voice cutting through the silence. "But we expect full cooperation moving forward. This isn't just about closing the case, it's about making sure that this never happens again." Jenna nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. Her lawyer remained quiet, clearly aware that the fight had shifted in Ava's favor. Ava glanced at David and the other executives, who were still processing the gravity of what had just unfolded. There was no going back now. The company had reached a crossroads, and Ava had made it clear which path they would be taking. "This isn't the end," Ava said quietly, addressing the room. "It's the beginning of something better. We're going to rebuild this company from the ground up, and that starts with owning our mistakes and making real changes." The meeting adjourned shortly after, and as the others filed out of the room, Ava remained seated for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. It wasn't victory, not yet. There was still so much work to be done. But it was a step forward. A step toward creating a culture that truly reflected the values she had always believed in. As Olivia packed up the last of the documents, she looked over at Ava, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You did it, Ava. We're moving in the right direction." Ava exhaled slowly, nodding. "We are, but we're not done yet." Ava Brooks sat in the quiet of her office, watching the early morning light filter through the glass windows. The confrontation with Jenna Riley had been a turning point, but now the real work began, the aftermath. The company was poised on the edge of a transformation, and Ava could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her personal vindication. It was about changing an entire system. The previous week had been a whirlwind of meetings and difficult conversations. Jenna's public apology, though far from perfect, had sent ripples through the airline. For the first time, employees were openly talking about the culture that had silently permeated the company for years. Some were uncomfortable with the shift, while others, particularly those who had quietly suffered, began to feel hopeful that real change was coming. Ava's phone buzzed on her desk, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Olivia. "Court ruled in our favor. Formal settlement agreement being drafted. We can discuss terms today." Ava's heart skipped a beat. They had won. After months of legal battles, emotional strain, and seemingly endless meetings, the court had ruled in their favor. Jenna Riley would face formal consequences for her actions, and the airline would be held accountable for its role in allowing discriminatory behavior to persist. But more importantly, this legal victory meant that the reforms Ava had been pushing for could no longer be brushed aside. Ava leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment as the weight of the news settled in. It wasn't just about the legal victory, it was about the validation of everything she had fought for. The truth had been laid bare, and now the company had no choice but to move forward with the comprehensive changes she had envisioned. Later that afternoon, Ava and Olivia met with the airline's legal and executive teams to finalize the terms of the settlement. David Harrington, the chief operating officer, sat across from them, looking more composed than he had in previous weeks. Ava could sense that the reality of the situation had finally sunk in for him. The time for resistance had passed. It was time to rebuild. Olivia, ever the professional, laid out the terms in a calm, precise manner. As part of the settlement, the airline will implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, starting at the executive level and extending to every member of staff, from flight attendants to ground crew. David nodded, though his expression remained neutral. Ava could tell he still harbored some concerns about the financial impact of the reforms, but he also understood that there was no turning back. "We'll also be reviewing the complaint process," Olivia continued. "Every report of discrimination or mistreatment will be thoroughly investigated, and no complaints will be dismissed without a full review by an independent committee." David shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes meeting Ava's. "Ava, you know this isn't going to be easy. Implementing these changes across the entire company will take time and resources." Ava nodded, her voice steady. "I understand that, David. But doing the right thing isn't always easy. This is about more than just protecting the company from legal consequences. It's about creating a culture where everyone is treated with respect, where every passenger and employee feels safe and valued." David sighed but nodded in agreement. "You're right. We should have addressed this a long time ago." Olivia continued with the rest of the terms. Jenna Riley would be placed on leave, pending further investigation, and the company would make a public commitment to addressing systemic discrimination. The airline would also provide compensation to affected employees and passengers who had come forward with complaints. When the meeting concluded, Ava felt a sense of closure beginning to take root. It wasn't about punishment or retribution. This was about making sure that what had happened to her and to others like her would never happen again. In the days that followed, the news of the settlement broke, sparking a media frenzy. Headlines splashed across newspapers and news sites. "Airline settles in discrimination case, major reforms on the way." CEO Ava Brooks leads fight for corporate accountability. Airline faces reckoning after racial discrimination lawsuit. For the first time, Ava wasn't anxious about the media attention. This was the story she wanted out there, a story about transformation, about owning up to mistakes and pushing for a better future. The narrative had shifted from a scandal to one of accountability and growth. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Messages flooded in from across the world, customers, employees, and even people who had never flown with the airline, thanking Ava for standing up, for refusing to let the issue be swept under the rug. Some shared their own stories of being mistreated or overlooked, inspired by Ava's determination to fight back. But Ava's focus was already on the future. The reforms were being rolled out across the company, starting with the senior leadership team. The diversity and inclusion training sessions were designed not just as a formality, but as a real opportunity for change. The program would include practical workshops where employees would learn how their unconscious biases could affect their work, and how to create a more inclusive environment for all passengers. Ava personally oversaw the training for the executive team, determined to ensure that the changes started at the top. She stood at the front of the room, addressing the group of senior leaders, some of whom had been with the company since its inception. "This is where the real work begins," Ava said, her voice strong but filled with purpose. "It's not enough to implement policies. We have to live them. We have to show our employees, our customers, and the world that we're committed to being better." There were murmurs of agreement around the room, but Ava knew that words were only the beginning. Action was what mattered now. Real change required commitment, and she was prepared to lead that charge. A few weeks later, as the dust settled and the company began to adjust to the new changes, Ava found herself sitting in her office once again, looking out at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the buildings. The long journey, filled with emotional highs and lows, was finally beginning to pay off. Her phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. "Training sessions going well. Staff feedback is positive so far. We're making progress." Ava smiled, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. The path had been difficult, but every step had been worth it. The culture of the airline was shifting, little by little, toward one of fairness and respect. There was still much work to be done, but the foundation had been laid. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Christine Larkin, the former flight attendant who had come forward with her testimony. She had recently rejoined the airline in a new role, part of the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. "Ava, do you have a minute?" Christine asked, stepping into the office. "Of course," Ava replied, motioning for her to sit. Christine smiled, Her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pride. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. I never thought I'd have the courage to speak up, but you made that possible. And now things are really changing." Ava's smile widened. "You don't have to thank me, Christine. You're the one who had the courage to come forward. This change it's because of all of us." Christine nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I've been talking to some of the newer flight attendants, and they're already noticing a difference. People are more aware, more mindful of how they treat passengers. It's a start, but it's a good one." Ava leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. The airline was on the path to becoming the company she had always envisioned, a place where everyone, regardless of who they were or what they looked like, was treated with dignity and respect. "We've come a long way," Ava said softly, "but we're not done yet." Christine nodded in agreement. "No, we're not. But at least now, we're moving in the right direction." Months had passed since the settlement was finalized, and the airline was slowly but surely transforming. The diversity and inclusion initiatives had expanded beyond training sessions to include mentorship programs, employee resource groups, and a new system for handling complaints that ensured every issue was addressed with transparency and accountability. Ava had made sure to stay deeply involved in the process, regularly meeting with staff and listening to their feedback. She knew that real change wasn't something that could be mandated from the top. It had to be cultivated from within, nurtured by every employee. On one particular morning, Ava found herself on a flight, this time as a passenger, seated in first class once again. But this flight felt different. The atmosphere was lighter, the staff friendlier. As she looked around, she noticed something she hadn't seen on her previous flights: diversity. The crew was made up of people from various backgrounds, and the passengers reflected the same diversity. A flight attendant approached her, smiling warmly. "Ms. Brooks, can I get you anything?" Ava smiled back, feeling a sense of pride in how far the company had come. "Just some water, thank you." As the flight attendant walked away, Ava leaned back in her seat, gazing out the window at the clouds rolling by. The fight had been long and hard, but the reward was clear: a company that had embraced change, that had grown stronger because of it. Ava knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always more work to be done. But for now, she could rest easy, knowing that she had made a real difference, not just for herself, but for countless others. As the plane soared through the sky, Ava felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The airline she had built was finally living up to the vision she had always dreamed of, one where everyone had a seat at the table, and everyone was treated with the respect they deserved. And in that moment, Ava knew that she had truly won. Ava Brooks never sought recognition. In her heart, she had always believed that real change didn't need the spotlight. It needed dedication, persistence, and the courage to stand up when it mattered most. As the months turned into a year since the settlement, her life had settled into a new rhythm. The airline had undergone a transformation that extended beyond its policies. It had reshaped its identity. And while Ava felt a deep sense of accomplishment, she knew there was still more to be done. One crisp autumn morning, Ava was invited to speak at a national conference on corporate responsibility and diversity. The event had drawn leaders from various industries, eager to discuss how businesses could not only survive, but thrive by fostering inclusive environments. As Ava stood backstage, reviewing her notes, she reflected on how far she had come and how far the company had come, thanks to the battle she had fought. "Ava, you're up in 5, Olivia said, coming up beside her with a reassuring smile. Ava nodded, feeling a familiar surge of energy as she prepared to step into the limelight. She wasn't one for grand speeches, but this was different. This was a moment where she could share her story and inspire others to take the same steps, to hold their own companies accountable, and foster a culture where everyone felt valued. As the conference host introduced her, Ava took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The bright lights of the auditorium illuminated the hundreds of faces watching her intently, but she wasn't nervous. She was ready. "Good morning," Ava began, her voice strong yet warm. "Thank you for having me here today. I want to start by saying that change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because one person decides it's time. It happens when a collective force within a company, a community, or a society says enough is enough. The audience was silent, their attention fixed on Ava as she continued. A little over a year ago, I stood in the same position many of you are in, now leading a company, grappling with complex issues, and faced with a decision that would define not just my business, but who I was as a leader. The story many of you know began with a single flight. A flight where I, a black woman, a CEO, was made to feel like I didn't belong in a seat I had rightfully paid for. But that flight was just the catalyst. Ava paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. What followed was a journey of accountability, one where I and my team had to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the company I had built had allowed a toxic culture to take root. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to step back, moments when I questioned whether the fight was worth it. But it was worth it. Because it wasn't just about me, it was about every person who had ever felt marginalized, dismissed, or disrespected because of who they were or how they looked. The audience remained silent, hanging on to every word. The auditorium was packed, the hum of conversation filling the air as Marcus stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. We've implemented diversity and inclusion training across every level of our company, restructured our complaint processes to ensure that no voice goes unheard, and fostered an environment where our employees and passengers know that they are valued. But I'm not here to talk about our success. I'm here to challenge you all to look within your own organizations. Because the truth is, this issue isn't isolated to one company, one industry, or one country. A few heads nodded in agreement. Ava could feel the connection she was building with the room. This isn't just about doing what's good for business, though. Let me assure you, it is good for business. It's about doing what's right. It's about standing for something, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncomfortable. As leaders, we have the power to create environments where everyone, regardless of race, gender, background, or status, feels like they belong. Ava took another breath, softening her tone as she prepared to close. It took one moment, one incident, to start the change within my company. But it took the commitment of many, my legal team, my employees, my fellow leaders, to see that change through. I ask each of you today to go back to your organizations and ask yourself, what kind of culture am I building? And is it one where every person feels respected? They had lived it too. The lights dimmed slightly, and the conference host returned to the stage, thanking Ava for her powerful words. As she walked off stage, Olivia was there to greet her, smiling with pride. "You were incredible," Olivia said, giving Ava a light pat on the back. "You might not love public speaking, but you have a gift for it." Ava laughed softly. "I just spoke from the heart. Hopefully, it makes a difference." Olivia nodded. "It will. Believe me, it will." Back at the office, life had settled into a new normal. Ava continued to oversee the company's transformation, but she had also shifted her focus to broader initiatives, helping other businesses implement the same reforms she had championed within her airline. Her work was no longer confined to her own company. She had become a voice for change across industries, a role model for other leaders who wanted to create inclusive environments. A few days after the conference, Ava received an unexpected email. It was from Jenna Riley. "Ava, I hope this message finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened over the past year. It's taken me a long time to process, but I wanted to reach out to thank you. Not for what happened, but for showing me what accountability looks like. I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and I've started working on myself. I've enrolled in a course on cultural sensitivity and inclusion, and am taking steps to understand how my actions affected you and others. I realize now that I was part of the problem, and for that, I am truly sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm committed to becoming better. I hope that in time, I can be part of the solution. Thank you again, Jenna." Ava read the email twice, absorbing Jenna's words. It was clear that Jenna had gone through her own journey of self-reflection, a journey Ava had never expected her to take. Ava had already moved past the pain of that flight, but reading Jenna's message gave her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about knowing that change, real change, was possible, even for those who had been part of the problem. Ava replied simply, "I appreciate your message, Jenna. Wishing you the best on your journey." As the months rolled on, Ava's work continued to expand. She partnered with nonprofits focused on workplace diversity, spoke at universities, and even sat down with government officials to discuss policies that would encourage corporate accountability. Her airline had become a model for other companies looking to reform their practices, and Ava had become a leader not just in business, but in the fight for social justice. One evening, as she sat in her penthouse apartment, sipping tea and looking out at the city skyline, Ava felt a profound sense of peace. She had been through so much rising from humble beginnings, building a business empire and fighting against the injustices that had tried to hold her back. But she hadn't just fought for herself. She had fought for something larger, something that would outlast her. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Olivia. "We're receiving another award for our diversity initiatives. Congratulations, Ava. Your work is being recognized everywhere." Ava smiled softly, her heart full. She had never sought the accolades, but knowing that her efforts were making a difference filled her with pride. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Ava felt that she had truly found her purpose. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a change-maker, someone who had taken the pain of her experiences and turned it into something powerful, something that would continue to ripple through the world long after her work was done. As Ava gazed out at the lights of the city, she whispered softly to herself, thinking of her late mother's words, "Keep going, Ava. Don't give up." And she wouldn't. Not ever. Ava Brooks' journey had taken her to places she never thought possible. The airline's transformation was well underway, and her influence had grown beyond the company she founded. She had become a national figure and advocate for corporate accountability, a voice for inclusion, and a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. But for Ava, the work wasn't finished. In the months following the conference, Ava received requests to speak at panels, consult with other businesses, and even participate in discussions with lawmakers on the broader implications of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. She was excited, but also keenly aware that real change required more than just speeches, it required concrete action. One of the organizations that had been watching Ava's work closely was a leading civil rights group, the National Equity Initiative. Their mission was to promote systemic reforms in companies across the country, and they saw Ava as the ideal partner to help push forward a major campaign that would aim to enforce stronger policies around corporate discrimination. Ava received a personal invitation from the organization's president, Dr. Teresa Gardner, to meet and discuss how they could collaborate. Ava walked into the sleek offices of the National Equity Initiative, greeted warmly by Dr. Gardner herself. Teresa was a formidable woman, known for her deep knowledge of civil rights law and her relentless pursuit of justice. She had spent decades in the fight for racial and gender equality and had a reputation for creating long-lasting impact. "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you, Ava," Teresa said with a wide smile, shaking Ava's hand. "I've followed your journey with great admiration." "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Gardner," Ava replied, grateful for the opportunity. "I've been inspired by the work you've done. I think we can do something really meaningful together." They sat down in a bright conference room, its walls lined with framed photos of civil rights leaders. Teresa wasted no time diving into the heart of their meeting. "Ava, your work with the airline has set a precedent. You've demonstrated that one person can make a difference, and that corporate culture can be transformed. What we're trying to do is take that model and make it applicable to every industry. We need businesses across the country to adopt these reforms, not just because it's good PR, but because it's necessary for a just society." Ava nodded, completely in sync with the vision. "I agree. The changes we made at the airline are just the beginning. There are so many companies that have deep-rooted problems, and those won't be fixed by surface-level training sessions. It's going to take systemic reform." Teresa smiled, clearly pleased with Ava's passion. "Exactly. That's why we want you to help lead our new initiative. We're calling it the Corporate Accountability Project, or CAP. The goal is to work directly with CEOs, HR departments, and government officials to draft industry-wide guidelines for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to create a blueprint that businesses across the country can follow." Ava's heart quickened with excitement. This was what she had been working toward all along, a chance to take her personal fight and expand it on a national level. "I'm in," she said without hesitation. "I want to be part of this." That's the spirit. The Corporate Accountability Project gained momentum quickly, attracting interest from major corporations, lawmakers, and nonprofit organizations alike. Ava's role involved meeting with corporate leaders, sharing her own experiences, and helping them understand the importance of deep, structural change. One of her first major meetings was with Dan Matthews, the CEO of a major tech company that had been facing criticism for its lack of diversity in leadership. The company had struggled to attract and retain employees from marginalized backgrounds, and its internal culture had been called into question after several high-profile resignations. Dan greeted Ava warmly when she arrived at the tech company's headquarters, but she could tell that he was nervous. Like many CEOs, he was concerned about how the public perceived his company and how the changes Ava was suggesting might affect his bottom line. "Look, Ava," Dan began as they sat down, "I get it. Diversity is important, and we've made some efforts, but it's hard. Our industry moves fast, and sometimes it feels like we don't have the luxury of focusing on these kinds of initiatives when we're just trying to stay competitive." Ava smiled, understanding the pressure Dan was under. But she wasn't going to let him off the hook. "Dan, I know you're trying to run a successful business. People look at me differently because of how I look, because of where my family is from." Dan's eyes flickered, and Ava could see that her words were resonating. She leaned in, her voice calm but firm. "You don't have to choose between success and diversity. In fact, the two go hand in hand. The more diverse perspectives you have in the room, the more innovative your company will be. But you have to be willing to do the work, real, meaningful work. And that starts with leadership. It starts with you." Dan sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're right. I know you're right. I guess I need help figuring out how to get there." Ava smiled, feeling the familiar sense of satisfaction that came with knowing she was making a difference. "That's why I'm here." The Corporate Accountability Project began gaining traction in other industries as well: finance, healthcare, retail. Ava worked tirelessly with CEOs and executives to create individualized plans that would foster diversity and inclusion within their ranks. Each company had its own challenges, but Ava's approach was always the same: be direct, be honest, and be committed to change. Meanwhile, Ava's airline continued to thrive. The changes she had implemented were yielding positive results, with employee satisfaction at an all-time high and passenger complaint related to discrimination significantly reduced. The company's reputation had not only recovered, but had been strengthened by its commitment to inclusivity. Investors, once wary of the costs of reform, were now praising the airline's progressive stance and seeing the financial benefits of a happy, engaged workforce. Ava's schedule was relentless, but the rewards were undeniable. She had become more than just a CEO. She was a symbol of corporate reform, a leader who had turned her personal experience into a national movement. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ava returned to her office and found an invitation waiting for her on her desk. It was from the White House. She opened the elegant envelope and read the message inside. "Dear Ms. Brooks, the President of the United States requests the honor of your presence at a roundtable discussion on corporate diversity and inclusion to be held at the White House next month. Your leadership and contributions to this important issue have made a significant impact, and we would be honored to have your voice in this conversation." Ava sat down stunned. She had never imagined that her journey would take her this far. From fighting a single battle on a flight to being invited to the White House to discuss national policies on corporate accountability, it was more than she had ever dreamed of. As she sat in the quiet of her office, the weight of the invitation settled in. This was no longer just about her airline, or even about the companies she had worked with through the Corporate Accountability Project. This was about shaping the future of the entire country's approach to diversity, inclusion, and fairness in the workplace. Ava picked up the phone and called Olivia. "You're not going to believe this," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "I just got invited to the White House." As Ava walked out of her office that day, the sun shining brightly above her, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had spent her life fighting for what she believed in, and now she could see the fruits of that labor everywhere she looked. Her legacy wasn't just in the companies she had transformed, or the policies she had helped implement. It was in the lives she had touched, the people who had found their voices, who had broken through barriers, and who were now carrying the torch forward. Ava smiled as she stepped into the bustling street, knowing that her work would live on through the countless leaders she had inspired. This was her legacy, a world where everyone had the opportunity to thrive, where diversity was celebrated, and where accountability was the foundation of every successful business. And even though the work was far from over, Ava knew that she had made a lasting difference. If you've been inspired by Ava's journey and want to hear more stories about leadership, accountability, and creating positive change in the world, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue spreading the message of inclusion and fairness and help build a world where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. Stay tuned for more stories of transformation and leadership, because real change begins with us. Hit that subscribe button and don't miss out on the next chapter of this incredible journey. It's about a system that has been built to ignore the needs of people of color. It's about a culture that allows bias to go unchecked, because it's easier to look the other way. The audience was silent, their attention fully on Marcus. "But we can change that," he continued. "We've seen it happen before. When we come together, when we hold institutions accountable, we can make real progress. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take sustained effort, and it's going to take all of us." When Marcus finished his speech, the applause was thunderous. He had become more than just a survivor of discrimination. He was now a leader in the fight to dismantle the very systems that had harmed him, and so many others. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his hotel room, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. From that first encounter with Gary Matthews at Green Hill Pharmacy to standing in front of national leaders calling for systemic reform, his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. He thought about the people he had met along the way: Sarah, Darren, Olivia Reed, the other victims who had come forward to share their stories. Each of them had played a part in this fight, and each of them had helped to push the needle of justice forward, even if just a little. Marcus pulled out his notebook, a habit he had developed during the lawsuit, where he jotted down thoughts and reflections. He opened to a blank page and began to write. "Change is slow, but it's happening. Every fight, every voice, every story, it all adds up. I never wanted to be the face of anything, but now that I'm here, I can't turn back. We can't turn back. The fight for justice is hard, but it's the only fight worth having." He closed the notebook, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt at peace with where it was leading him. The more Marcus involved himself in national advocacy, the more he realized that systemic change required collaboration between different sectors of society. The fight for racial justice in healthcare couldn't be won by lawsuits alone, needed the engagement of doctors, nurses, policymakers, and, most importantly, the communities that had been most affected. One of the most significant moments in Marcus' journey came when he was invited to attend a summit on healthcare reform hosted by the American Medical Association, AMA. Healthcare leaders from across the country were gathering to discuss how to address racial disparities in patient care, and Marcus had been asked to participate in a panel alongside healthcare professionals and other advocates. Walking into the Grand Conference Hall in Chicago, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of both awe and apprehension. The stakes felt higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his own justice anymore, he was pushing for a transformation of the entire healthcare system. And now he would be standing alongside some of the most powerful voices in the field. As the panel discussion began, Marcus listened carefully to the doctors and policy experts who spoke before him. They talked about the data, the studies that showed how patients of color were less likely to receive adequate care, how their pain was often underestimated, how their symptoms were dismissed. But what was missing from the conversation, Marcus realized, was the human side, the lived experiences of the people who had suffered because of these biases. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood and took a deep breath. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, and once again, that familiar nervousness crept up his spine. But he had learned to harness that feeling. "I've heard a lot of great ideas here today," Marcus began, his voice steady but passionate. "But we can't forget the people who live this every day. The people who walk into clinics and hospitals and pharmacies and feel like they're not being seen. I'm not a doctor, but I am someone who has lived through this. I've been treated like a criminal for doing nothing more than asking for the same treatment anyone else would get. And that experience isn't unique to me." The room was silent, and Marcus could see that his words were hitting their mark. "We can talk about policy and data all day," Marcus continued, "but if we don't acknowledge the real stories, the real people behind those numbers, we'll never get anywhere. What we need is to build bridges between healthcare providers and the communities they serve, between those in power and those who've been silenced. We need empathy, we need understanding, and we need accountability." The applause that followed was polite but genuine. As Marcus sat down, he knew that the fight ahead would be just as tough as the battles he'd already fought. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. He was working with people who shared his vision for a better, more equitable future. On one of his returns to Riverton, Marcus was surprised to see just how much had changed in the years since his court victory. The small town had started its own conversations about racism, spearheaded by local leaders and community groups. People who had once stayed silent about their own experiences were now speaking up, sharing their stories in town hall meetings and community forums. One of the most encouraging developments was that Green Hill Pharmacy, under new management, had implemented a comprehensive anti-bias training program for its employees. Gary Matthews was long gone, but the pharmacy had taken steps to rebuild trust with the community. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. One afternoon, as Marcus strolled through downtown Riverton, he saw Olivia Reed, the reporter who had first written his story. She was sitting outside a cafe, sipping a coffee and reading a book. "Marcus," Olivia called, waving him over. "How's the big-time advocate?" Marcus smiled as he approached her table. "I wouldn't call it that," he said, sitting down. "I'm just trying to do my part." "Don't be modest," Olivia said, her eyes twinkling. "You've done more than just your part. People around here are starting to pay attention. You've made a real difference." Marcus glanced down the street, where people moved about their day as if nothing had changed. But he knew better. Underneath the surface, Riverton had shifted. "I just hope we can keep the momentum going," he said. "It's easy to start these conversations, but keeping them alive, that's the hard part." Olivia nodded. "True, but look at where we were a year ago. No one in this town was even talking about racial bias, let alone doing something about it. And now people are aware. They're engaged. That's because of you." Marcus smiled, grateful for her words. "I guess you're right. I miss him." Marcus paused, considering the question. He had been so focused on the immediate battles, the lawsuit, the advocacy work, that he hadn't had much time to think about the future. But now, as things began to settle, he realized he had a new path ahead of him. "I think I'm going to keep teaching," Marcus said. "But I also want to keep working on this issue, both here in Riverton and nationally. There's so much more to be done, and I want to be a part of it." Olivia smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." As the months went on, Marcus continued to split his time between his teaching job in Riverton and his advocacy work on a broader scale. But more and more, he found himself drawn to the local community, the place where it had all started. He began working closely with local organizers, helping to create programs that addressed racial inequality in all aspects of Riverton life, not just healthcare, but education, law enforcement, and local businesses. The goal was to create a town where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel safe and respected. One of the most important initiatives Marcus helped launch was a youth mentorship program, pairing local high school students with mentors who could provide guidance and support. Many of these students, particularly those from marginalized communities, lacked access to the resources and opportunities they needed to succeed. Marcus saw the program as a way to give back to the community that had shaped him and to invest in the next generation. During one of the program's mentorship sessions, Marcus sat with a group of students, listening as they shared their thoughts on race, opportunity, and the future. One young man, a quiet kid named Jamal, raised his hand. "Mr. James," Jamal began hesitantly, "I know you went through a lot with that case at Green Hill. Do you ever feel like you made the right choice? Like, was it worth it?" The question took Marcus by surprise, but after a moment, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "It was hard, and there were times when I doubted myself. But in the end, I know I did the right thing." The foundation became a beacon of hope for those who needed it most, a testament to Tom's legacy and to the power of redemption. It's uncomfortable and it's scary. But if we don't stand up for ourselves and for others, nothing ever changes. Jamal looked thoughtful, nodding as he absorbed Marcus' words. "That's why we're all here today," Marcus continued, looking around at the students. "You all have the power to make a difference. It might not seem like it now, but one day, when you're faced with a choice to stand up or stay silent, you'll know what to do." The room was quiet, but Marcus could see the impact his words had on the students. They were listening. They were learning. And that was the most important thing. As Marcus reflected on everything he had accomplished, the lawsuit, the advocacy, the mentorship program, he realized that his life had taken on a new purpose. He was no longer just a teacher in a small town, he was a leader, an advocate, and a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. But through it all, Marcus remained humble. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, and that every victory was just one step in a much larger journey. There would always be more to do, more battles to fight, more voices to uplift. One evening, as he sat on his front porch, watching the sun set over Riverton, Marcus allowed himself a moment of peace. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. He thought about his mother, Elaine, who had worried so much about him during the lawsuit, and about Darren, who had stood by his side through every step of the process. He thought about Sarah Collins, who had believed in him even when he doubted himself. And he thought about the countless people across the country who had supported him, who had shared their own stories, and who had inspired him to keep going. This was just the beginning. The fight for racial justice, for equality, for a better world, it was long, difficult, and full of setbacks. But Marcus James was ready, and with that thought, he stood up, ready to face the new day ahead. The sun dipped below the horizon as Marcus stood on his porch, taking in the quiet evening. Riverton was still the same small town he had always known, but for him, it felt different now. His life had been transformed by the journey he had taken, a journey he hadn't asked for but had embraced when it mattered most. The court victory against Green Hill Pharmacy had been more than just a personal triumph, it had been a wake-up call for the town, and for many others across the country. People were beginning to understand that racism wasn't always loud and obvious sometimes. It was hidden in plain sight, woven into the everyday interactions that shaped people's lives. As Marcus reflected on the past year, he knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. There were still many more battles to come, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had seen firsthand the power of speaking up, of refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. And he wasn't done yet. The youth mentorship program was thriving, giving young people in Riverton the tools and guidance they needed to navigate a world that wasn't always fair. His advocacy work had grown beyond the town's borders, reaching a national audience that was eager for change. And through it all, Marcus remained grounded in his core belief that standing up for what was right was always worth the cost. His phone buzzed with a new message from Darren. "You ready for tomorrow? Big rally in the city." Marcus smiled. There was always something on the horizon, always another step to take. He typed back, "I'll be there. Let's keep this going." Closing the door behind him, Marcus sat down at his kitchen table, pulling out his notebook and jotting down a few thoughts. He knew that the fight for equality and justice would require persistence and courage, but he was ready for whatever came next. He was more than just a teacher, no, he was a voice for those who had been unheard for too long, and he wasn't going to stop until real change had been achieved. With a deep breath, Marcus closed the notebook, stood up, and walked toward the future with a quiet but determined resolve. Thank you for reading Marcus' Journey. If you've enjoyed this story and want to be part of more inspiring journeys and creative stories, be sure to hit the subscribe button below to stay updated. Your support helps keep these stories going. As part of this foundation, part of this family, and that will never change. Rachel nodded, her eyes full of gratitude and love. "I'm glad we found our way back to each other, Mary. I'm glad we built this together." Mary's throat tightened with emotion. "So am I," she whispered. "It's the greatest gift I've ever been given." As the evening grew darker and the park began to empty, David ran over to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Grandma, Mom," he called, waving from across the field. "We're going to get ice cream, want to come?" Rachel laughed and shook her head. "You go ahead, sweetie. We'll catch up in a bit." David grinned and gave them a thumbs up before running off with his friends, leaving Mary and Rachel alone on the bench, the quiet of the evening settling around them. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the sky turn from orange to pink to deep purple. The oak tree they had planted for Tom stood tall and strong nearby, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. It had grown so much over the years, just like their family, steady, resilient, and rooted in love. After a long moment, Rachel broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the future," she said quietly. Mary glanced at her, sensing the seriousness in Rachel's tone. "What about it?" Rachel smiled faintly. "About what's next for the foundation, for David, for all of us." Mary listened intently, knowing that Rachel's words held the weight of something important. "I've been thinking," Rachel continued, "that maybe it's time for David to start thinking about college. He's been talking a lot about studying social work, or maybe even education. He wants to help kids, just like the foundation does." Mary's heart swelled with pride. "That's wonderful," she said, her voice full of warmth. "He's got such a big heart, just like Tom." Rachel nodded. "He does, and I think he's ready for the next step. But I also think it's time for me to take a step back from the foundation. I've been running things for a long time, and while I love it, I want to focus more on David and what comes next for him." Mary's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, but as she looked at Rachel, she saw the wisdom in her words. Rachel had poured her heart and soul into the foundation for years, and now it was time for her to shift her focus. David was growing up, and Rachel wanted to be there for him as he took on the challenges of adulthood. "I understand," Mary said softly. "But what about the foundation? You've been the heart of it." Rachel smiled warmly. "The foundation has a life of its own now. We've built something that can carry on without us being there every day. And besides, he'll still be involved, just not as much as before." Mary nodded, feeling a mixture of sadness and understanding. The foundation had been their joint effort, a way to honor Tom's memory and give back to the community. But now, it was time for things to change, for the next generation to step up and take the reins. "Who do you think will take over?" Mary asked, her curiosity piqued. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I've been thinking about asking David." Mary's eyes widened in surprise. "David?" Rachel nodded, her eyes twinkling with pride. "He's young, but he's passionate about the foundation. He's been involved for years, and I think he's ready to take on more responsibility. Of course, we'd still be there to guide him, but I think it's time for him to start making his own mark." Mary felt her heart swell with emotion. The thought of David taking over the foundation, carrying on the work that had started with Tom, felt like the perfect way to continue their legacy. It was a full-circle moment that felt deeply meaningful. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Mary said softly. "He's going to do great things." Rachel smiled, her eyes misting over with emotion. "I think so too." A few months later, David officially took on a leadership role at the foundation. Though he was still young, he approached the position with a maturity and wisdom that belied his age. He worked tirelessly, organizing new programs, meeting with community leaders, and mentoring the next generation of volunteers. Mary watched with pride as David grew into his role, stepping confidently into the legacy that Tom had left behind. The foundation continued to thrive, expanding its reach and helping more families than ever before.
It was everything they had dreamed of and more.
One afternoon, as Mary sat in her office at the foundation, reviewing some paperwork, David knocked on the door and poked his head inside. "Hey, Grandma," he said with a smile. "Got a minute?" Mary looked up from her desk and smiled warmly. "Of course. Come on in." David stepped inside and sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something," he began, his tone serious. Mary set down her papers, giving him her full attention. "What's on your mind?" David hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, his eyes bright with determination. "I want to start a new program at the foundation, something specifically for kids who have lost a parent." Mary's heart skipped a beat. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," she said softly. "What made you think of it?" David glanced out the window, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately," he said quietly, "about how much I wish I could have known him. And I know there are other kids out there who feel the same way about their parents' kids who are dealing with that kind of loss. I want to create a space where they can talk about it, where they can get support, and feel like they're not alone." Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. She had always known that David had a big heart, but hearing him speak with such passion and empathy filled her with pride. "That's a beautiful idea, David," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think your dad would be so proud of you." David smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just want to make a difference, like he did." Mary reached across the desk and took David's hand, squeezing it gently. "You already are," she said softly, "and I know this program will help so many kids. I'll do everything I can to support you." David nodded, his smile growing. "Thanks, Grandma. That means a lot." The program, called Healing Hearts, launched a few months later, and it quickly became one of the most successful initiatives at the foundation. Children who had experienced loss found a safe space to share their feelings, connect with others, and receive emotional support. The program offered counseling, art therapy, and group activities designed to help children process their grief in healthy and meaningful ways. Mary watched as the program flourished, and she couldn't help but feel that Tom's spirit was guiding them every step of the way. His dream of building a better future for the next generation was alive and well, carried forward by his son and the family he had left behind. As the years went by, the foundation continued to grow, and David eventually became its full-time director. His leadership was marked by compassion, innovation, and a deep commitment to the community. Mary remained involved, though she took on a more advisory role, content to watch as David and the team carried on the work she and Rachel had started. On a bright spring day, Mary, Rachel, and David gathered once again beneath the oak tree they had planted for Tom so many years ago. The tree had grown tall and strong, its branches spreading wide to provide shade and comfort. It had become a symbol of everything they had built together, of love, of family, and of the strength to overcome. As they sat together on a bench, watching the children play in the park, Mary felt a profound sense of peace. She had come so far on her journey from a place of fear and guilt to a life filled with love, forgiveness, and purpose. She had made mistakes, but she had worked to make things right, and in the process, she had built something beautiful. Rachel leaned against Mary's shoulder, her face soft with contentment. "We did it, Mary," she whispered. "We built something lasting." Mary nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "We did," she whispered, "and it's all because of Tom." David, sitting across from them, smiled warmly. "Here's the reason we're all here," he said quietly. "And we're going to keep his legacy alive for as long as we can." Mary's heart swelled with pride and love. She had been given a second chance, and she had made the most of it. She had found redemption, not just for herself, but for her family and her community. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Mary looked up at the oak tree, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. She thought of Tom, of everything he had stood for, and she smiled. His legacy would live on, through the foundation, through David, and through the love that had brought them all together. And for Mary, that was enough. Do you believe in second chances? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.